Well, God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. Hey, Dr. Ernest Jones here. Excited about an opportunity to share the word with you on today. If you've seen the previous videos, you know that we're in a study on the book of Romans. We're going verse by verse, chapter by chapter, through this great book written by the Apostle Paul to the church at Rome. And today we have arrived to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. And it's exciting to be able to unpack this and look into what the Lord is saying here in Romans chapter 3. If you watch the last part of Romans chapter 2, I just want to remind you of what I talked about, or maybe you didn't see it, that way I can get you up, is that in Romans chapter 2, Paul was talking about true Jewness, what a true Jew is. And we looked at it in the last verse of chapter number 2, where Paul was talking about that a true Jew is someone who is not a Jew outwardly, if you will, but someone that is a Jew inwardly. There has been a circumcision of their heart. Okay, there's been a circumcision of their heart. And what he was talking about, because Judaism was, you're a true Jew if you've been circumcised. Okay, and that's a outward act. But Paul was saying you can have had the outward circumcision but not yet be a true Jew, because the true Jew at this time, with what Paul was saying, is one that had a circumcision of the heart and the spirit, not by the letter, by the spirit, not by the letter, which means that, hey, you've accepted Christ. You've accepted Christ, and there's been a change that has happened in your life. And so that's what, Paul was getting into about being a true Jew. Okay, he was telling them, hey, the law is good, all these other things are good. Okay, but if you're teaching someone not to commit adultery, are you committing adultery? If not, there's not have been a circumcision of your heart. Okay, if you're teaching people not to steal, but you're stealing, then again, there has not been a circumcision of your heart. And so Paul was really digging in on this in order for them to be what he's calling in this writing a true Jew. Or he that is a Jew is actually how he puts it. Okay, all right. So when I said all that to kind of set us up for chapter number 3, because with Paul saying what he said, kind of dismissively toward the Jews, Jews are a proud people, which they should be, proud people chosen by God to be God's representation in the earth, using this nation to bring glory unto Him. If you know the scriptures, you know where all that leads to. Okay, so with Paul saying on that, no doubt that this was either a offense to some Jews or borderline offense. Like, what are you saying about us? What are you talking about us, Paul? And so chapter number 3 is kind of dealing with, hey, I need y'all to understand what I'm saying. So chapter number 3 begins with this, and I'll read. First of all, let me read. Now, let me read some verses first. I was getting ready to start teaching, if you will. So let me read some verses to you. I'll read verses 1 through 8, and kind of deal with verses 1 through 8. It says, "What advantage then?" This is King James Version. "What advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way, chiefly because unto them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar. As it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. But if our unrighteousness commend the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? I speak as a man." This is Paul saying that. Verse 6, "God forbid, for then how shall God judge the world? For if the truth of God have abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? And not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come. whose damnation is just. All right, so those are the first 8 verses of Romans chapter 3. Interesting verses. So again, Paul had just giving a discourse on what a Jew is, and so, and how circumcision doesn't matter unless you circumcise in the heart, and you being a teacher of the law but not doing the law. You knowing the law really doesn't do anything for you, and so a Jew would hear that and kind of, as I said earlier, just be offended by that. And so Paul, knowing that he needs to deal with that, he begins with talking about, hey, what, verse number 1 again, what advantage then hath the Jew? Okay, what advantage then has the Jew? And or what profit is there of circumcision? So the question is, okay, Paul, we heard what you said in chapter number 2. Okay, so is there any advantage to being a Jew? Is there any advantage to circumcision? And what Paul, what it says in the King James Version, he says, much every way, much every way. That's how verse 2 starts out, much every way. In other words, in every way there's an advantage. In other words, he's saying, yes, there are great benefits to being a Jew. There are great benefits to being a Jew. So, but he says much every way, chiefly, and in other words, the main thing, the best thing, or the first of all thing, he says chiefly, because unto them were committed the oracles of God. Okay, so to the Jews, what was entrusted to the Jews was the whole revelation of God. They are the ones through who we get the fullness of the revelation of Yahweh, the fullness of the revelation of Elohim, the fullness of the revelation of Emmanuel, the fullness of the revelation of it, okay? We get that revelation of God. And when I said Emmanuel, I'm talking about God with us, not particularly Jesus, but God with us. And so we get the fullness of the revelation of them because God dealt with them. God chose them to be his people, and therefore God gives them the revelation of who he is, so that the nation of Israel is able to share the truth of who the one true and living God really is. So that's a great benefit of being a Jew, having that responsibility, being able to share with people who the real God is. So when they ask the question of, okay, so what's the benefit of being circumcised? What's the benefit of being a Jew? Well, it's the teaching. It's just the instructions. It's the, as it says in the King James, the oracles that you get. It's the truths that you have. It's the revelation that they have received. Okay? And so that's what Paul is telling them. That's the benefit. So when he gets to now verse number 3, Romans 3:3, it says, for what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? So he's saying, yeah, I'm dealing with Jews, and there are some that, were unfaithful. So true, some of them were unfaithful. But just because they were unfaithful, does not mean that God's going to be unfaithful. Okay? Just because they're unfaithful, it does not mean that God is going to be unfaithful. So, for what if some of them did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? And this is not, not what we believe about God. This is God's faithfulness toward them. Okay? He goes on to verse number 4 and says, God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but let every man be a liar. Let God be true, let every man be, as is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. Now, this is speaking of God, okay? Is God going to be unfaithful because the people are unfaithful? This is the question for the floor. Will God be unfaithful because the people are unfaithful? The good news about God is that God does not change his character based upon our character. Praise Jesus. God does not change his actions based upon our actions. God is a faithful God. And so it starts out with verse number 4, God forbid. In other words, of course not. That's whenever you see God forgive, it just simply means of course not. Okay, of course not. It did it. This famous thing it says here, let God be true, but every man a liar. Okay? Man will say that they're going to be faithful. Man will say they're going to live out the law. They're going to live out the gospel. They're going to live out the word of God. And then they don't do it. They don't follow through on what they say. And so it says here, when it comes to God and his faithfulness, let every man be a liar, but God's going to be true. God's going to be true to his character. God's going to be true to this word. God's going to be true to whatever he decides. Okay, God is going to be true to it. If he says it, he's going to do it. If he made a decision about it, it's going to come to pass. God's going to be true. So let every man be a liar, but let God's word, let him be true. And the reason why this was an important statement, it says, as it is written, that thou, and this talks about God, it's not talking about us, that God may be justified in whatever he says, or in whatever judgment that comes about, and might as overcome when he judges. So it's saying here, that God may be proved right, okay? That God may be proved right in what he says, and that he will win every case in court, if you will. It's really what he's dealing with here. He's really dealing with a court situation. So he's saying, you know what? Let God be true, because what God speaks is true. That way, that when there is an account, if there is someone proved to be right, if there's someone proved to be faithful, it will be God. Okay, it will be God. That God will be proved to be right in what God is saying, and therefore, when people are judging what God is saying or the decisions that he's making, okay, those decisions will be found to be true, because God is always faithful and God always operates from an area of justice. Okay, and so this is what it's saying. Now, the interesting thing about it, as they continue to think about what Paul is dealing with in the conversation that he's having, is that, okay, Paul, we hear what you're saying. God is righteous in his judgment. God is true. He's faithful. But then in verse number 5, in verse number 5, look at this. It says, but if our unrighteousness, okay, but if our unrighteousness commend the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? Now, note, I want you to see the last part. It says, I speak as a man. Okay, so Paul is being careful here in dealing with what he's talking about. He's saying, but some might say this, that our sinfulness serves a good purpose. Now again, we got to go back to what Paul was saying in chapter number 2 about being a Jew, and some of the points that he made there. And then, because he made those points, also looking at how that the Jews, because of how they lived, how that they, did not accept Christ as Savior, that because of that, it opened up the opportunity for others, for the Gentiles, to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. So in looking at that, Paul is saying that some of you are going to say, again, that our sinfulness was for a good purpose. But if our unrighteousness can commend the righteousness of God. So they're saying that our unrighteousness, because we just now saw that, God is going to be righteous in whatever he says. He's going to be faithful in whatever he does. That our righteousness brings some magnification of God's righteousness. Okay, now, and Paul is being tricky here, because people are being tricky here. Okay, so he says, but some might say that our sinfulness serves a good purpose, for it helps people see the righteousness of God. That's what they're saying, that our unrighteousness helps people to see the righteousness of God. And so therefore, the Jews want to say this, that it would be unfair for God to punish them for their unrighteousness, because their unrighteousness allowed the Gentiles in. Their unrighteousness, their disdain for the law, or for the righteousness of what God wanted them to live, or for the coming of Christ. Let's just get to it. That, because scriptures talk about in John that he came into his own, and his own received them not. But as many as received him, that's the Gentile, but as many, and the Jews that also received them, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to life. Okay, he gave the right to know Christ. And so now they're saying that, okay, Paul, we hear you, but our unrighteousness, therefore, has allowed others to see God's righteousness and accept God's righteousness. Therefore, it would be unfair for God to punish us because really our sin was for a purpose. Okay, so and so Paul is saying, he says, I speak as a man at the end of this, and what he's saying is that this is merely a human point of view. This is a human point of view when it comes to this, okay? And you can see that it's a human point of view because when he jumps back into conversation in verse number 6, he hits it again with the God forbid, okay? God forbid. Remember, verse number 4 started out with God forbid, and we're right back at God forbid again in verse number 6, okay? And he's saying, no, God forbid. In other words, again, of course not, okay? Of course not. For, here's the verse, for then how shall God judge the world? Okay? How shall God judge the world? So, of course not. If God were not entirely fair, he would not be qualified to judge the world. So, again, is God being unrighteous? Now, we've got to put the points together. Is God being unrighteous at the end of verse number, what is that? Verse number 5. Is God unrighteous when he taketh vengeance? Okay? So if God is making a judgment against those whose unrighteous acts led to a righteous revelation of who God is, now we want to know, the Jews want to know, is God, stick with me, this is technical stuff here, I understand, but is God being unrighteous when he acts in vengeance against the unrighteousness of the Jews? Now, he says, no, of course not. There is no way that God, when he makes a judgment, that God can be unrighteous, okay? Because if God is being unrighteous in this situation that they're talking about, then how can God judge the world? How can he be qualified to judge the world? Because therefore there would be unrighteousness in God. So here's the point. I want you to hear the point. The point is that whenever God judges, it always is a righteous judgment. Because if there is any point or time where God judges in unrighteousness, then we can question all of his judgments. Okay, so catch that. We can question all of his judgment. So therefore, when God judges, when God does the act of judging, in every situation where he judges in righteousness. So therefore, okay, when he judges the Jews or anybody, if there is unrighteousness in his judgment, then what can we say about him judging the world? Paul is saying there is never a time where God is an unrighteous judge. Okay? All right. So here's what they also. So now Paul anticipates what may be the response of hearing that. So verse number 7 says, well, first of all, verse number 7. For if the truth of God have more abounded through my lie, again, Paul's anticipating what they're saying. For if the truth of God have more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? So interesting. He's saying that some of you may argue, or, this is the argument that some may take up. How will God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? Okay, again, really trying to be, can't find a better word, it's not a theological word, but kind of be really slick here with God. God, my sin has caused others to see your glory because it allowed an open door for them to come in. Again, talking from the Jewish perspective, allowed the open door for them to come in. Well, therefore, how can you judge me as a sinner? This is what Paul said that you might try to argue. How can you judge me as a sinner if my dishonesty brings you more glory? Okay? And just really trying to manipulate this fact here that God, I don't think that your judgment is righteous because that judgment on my life was something that maybe I don't deserve because of what came out of it. What came out of it is that others got to know you. And so therefore I was used for your purpose in this thing. Okay? So my dishonesty brings you more glory. Just think about that. Think about, what they're saying here. Okay? That our sin brought other people close to you. And so therefore, don't judge us for our sin. Here's the thing about God. God is able to redeem what we do for his purpose, even if it's a mess up, even if it's a fault, even if it's something evil. God is able to redeem it for his purpose. But it still does not excuse us for whatever we may have done, because God takes it and works it for his good and works it for his favor. Does not mean that God is going to excuse us for the acts that we've done. Because what God wanted to do is that God wanted to use our obedience for his purpose. He wanted to use our faithfulness for his purpose. But now he has to take that unfaithfulness, he has to take that sin, that disobedience, and use it for his purpose. That just shows us the incredibleness of God, that God can take whatever hand he's dealt and use that hand and cause it to work out for his glory. That's all that's telling us. It's not telling us that what we did deserves applause, that what we did because of our fall deserves any glory. No, that doesn't deserve any glory. The glory still belongs to God for what God has done. And so we've got to remember that. And so the Jews were trying to manipulate this and say, hey, why are we being judged then? I mean, because what we did allowed the Gentiles to get in. All right. In verse number 8, even continues this thing of some were saying about Paul that Paul was even teaching this. Okay. This is what it says in verse number 8. We'll stop right here. And it says, King James again, and not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say. Okay, Paul is saying, not this either. Let us do evil that some good may come, whose damnation is just. Okay, and so this is what that some were reporting that Paul was teaching. They said that Paul was saying, the more we sin, the better it is. Okay? The more we sin, the better it is. In other words, the more we sin, the more the righteousness of God is shown. The more we sin, the more it opens up doors for others to get in. The more we sin, we're going to see all this thing happening. No. Okay? Paul is like, this is being slanderously reported. Paul is saying, I'm not teaching y'all to sin. I'm not teaching Jews to sin. And then God's going to give them some judgment that's going to excuse them. Okay? He actually says, okay, those who say such things deserve to be condemned. Okay? That's actually what he's saying. Yeah, the latter part of verse number 8, whose damnation is just. Paul is actually saying, y'all think that I'm teaching that the more you sin, the better it is, because somehow that's going to help other people, that somehow other people going to see the righteousness of God, that somehow that God's going to give you more grace, because there comes about this conversation later on. We're going to get into it, where there is this conversation of let's just continue sinning so grace may abound. Paul's like, no, again, God forbid. Again, of course not. Let's not do that. Okay, because how can we that are free from sin continue any longer therein? And this is kind of the conversation that they're having here about, hey, we're just gonna keep sinning because that's gonna help other people. Crazy, y'all. Crazy. The thinking. And Paul, instead of saying to him, yeah, you're right, he's saying to them, no, those who say such things deserve to be condemned. They deserve the condemnation of God. They deserve what is happening. They deserve the judgment of what's happening and what's going on. Okay? So those are the first 8 verses. And again, really, literally technical reading. A lot of people don't get into those verses. But Paul wanted to know that there are privileges that come along with being a Jew. There are privileges that come along with being a Jew, absolutely. But however, understand that one of those privileges is not that God is just going to wink at your sin and say, you're okay, you're good, thumbs up, because you know what, your sin contributed to other people coming into the kingdom of God. No, there's still going to be judgment that's going to happen. There's still going to be repercussions for sin. And Paul wanted them to know that. Okay, so next time what we'll do is that we'll jump a little further into this. And Paul is going to transition a little bit, talk about how that all people are sinners. All people are sinners. And again, building up the case for the need for salvation through Jesus Christ. Building up that case, continue to make that case be known that, hey, all people are sinners. We all need Jesus Christ. And he's really now, get ready, when we get into verses 9 and onward in chapter number 3, he's really going to show us the condition that we are in. Because he's going to again begin with the Jews and let the Jews understand really where they stand at in all this, and then where all of mankind stands at in all of this. Okay? So join me next time. Thank you for hanging out with me in Romans 3 today, 1 through 8, and we'll continue to have this conversation. Don't forget to subscribe, share, comment, and we'd love to hear from you as we continue to go through this study on the book of Romans. Okay? God bless you. See you again soon.